Okay, welcome everybody to the final Frontiers in Brain Health for spring of 2023. At Frontiers, we take a deep dive into the most exciting areas of brain research, and in this case, health research more broadly, and not just limiting ourselves to brains, but actually machine learning and machine thinking. I am Dan Causal, the Deputy Director here, and I welcome you to this very interesting event today. We will have some virtual questions coming in from our hybrid audience, as well as, of course, taking questions from the in-person group. If you are virtual for this, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to some of those questions. So today we have Richard Golden speaking. Richard is someone who actually started his career in electrical engineering at UCSD and at Brown. He then got a PhD in experimental psychology at Brown as well. He was an Andrew Mellon Fellow at the University of Pittsburgh and an NIH Fellow at Stanford before joining the faculty at UT Dallas, where he is basically the leader of cognitive science at UTD. He's also the head of the master's program for applied cognition and neuroscience, and very active in undergraduate cognitive science as a major. And I've had a lot of those students. They're great students. It's an amazing program. And Richard's just a fantastic mentor for students at all levels, and I've always thought so. Today he's going to share his expertise with us in the field of theoretical and applied statistical machine learning and mathematical modeling. For more than a decade, he's served as a member of the editorial boards of Neural Networks and the Journal of Mathematical Psychology. He's authored multiple important books on neural net modeling, including Statistical Machine Learning, a Unified Framework, which is going to its second edition. Richard is a true expert and has produced many excellent articles describing mathematical and neural net models and their applications. So this seemed like the perfect time to have an AI-based machine learning talk. You can hardly go near academia or life in general without thinking about AI, the future, the limitations, and also the potential. And so that's why it's particularly timely that Richard is here today to talk about some of the most exciting areas in causal modeling, causal reasoning. That is probably, I would say, among the top one or two aspects of human thinking. And when artificial neural nets can do this, it will be game-changing. And so we look forward to Richard Golden. Let's welcome him.
Thanks, Dan, and the Center for Brain Health and Sandy Chapman and others for inviting me to share with you some research that I've been working on for the past year or so. And the title of my talk, let's see. I got it. So the randomized controlled trial is typically considered to be, by most, to be the gold standard for investigating the causal effect of a treatment on outcome. And the basic idea is that you obtain a representative sample of participants from the population. You randomly assign the participants to different treatment groups. Each treatment group gets a different treatment. Then we collect the outcomes from each of the treatments, and then we look to see whether there's a treatment effect. And it's important to realize that the randomized controlled trial does have assumptions associated with it. For example, it starts off with this idea that we're obtaining a representative sample of participants from the population. So you really should ask yourself, is the original sample representative of the target population? Then the next step is you randomly assign participants to each treatment group. Well, is the random assignment of the participants to each treatment group truly random? And then you give treatments. Well, suppose you give treatment A at hospital X and treatment A at hospital Y. Is it okay to treat these two treatments of these two different hospitals as equivalent? And finally, the effects of treatment may depend on other factors too. So, for example, treatment A is more effective for might be more effective for children than older adults, or treatment C may not be effective if a participant is on a particular medication. So you can see that even the randomized controlled trial has some issues that regarding assumptions that we need to deal with. Now, in observational studies, we start with a representative sample of participants from the population as before, and then we collect for each participant the characteristics of the participant, the treatments associated with the participant, the outcomes, and then we look for the treatment effect. And the focus of this talk is, can we determine if there's a causal effect of treatment on outcome in this situation? And it's pretty clear right from the beginning that this is going to be much more challenging than a randomized controlled trial. The interpretation challenge, there's much greater interpretation challenges here. So given that, why bother with observational data analyses? Let's just do randomized controlled trials all the time. Okay, so that's not a bad idea, except we might want to it might take many years and resources to complete a randomized controlled trial. And some randomized controlled trials are unethical. Suppose you have a treatment that really works, and you want to see how effective it is. It would be unethical to randomly assign people who need the treatment, they don't even know, you get the treatment, you don't get the treatment, you get the treatment, you don't get the treatment, and then you want to measure exactly how effective the treatment is. Okay, so you would have trouble getting that through the IRB board. Also, randomized controlled trials are not really designed to deal with what-if analyses. And so what I mean by a what-if analysis is we have lots of data from the COVID pandemic about how many shots people received, mortality rates. And so we have all this data, and maybe we want to ask ourselves a question like, well, if we have all this data, can we figure out mathematically, what if everybody had exactly one COVID shot when the pandemic hit? What would have happened? Or suppose nobody had a COVID shot for 3 years. What would have happened based upon the data that we have? Another example of a what-if analysis would be, suppose we have a patient and we treat them using the best possible treatment, the treatment that works very effectively in the general population, but unfortunately this patient does not survive. Is there a way to do sort of a mathematical analysis to figure out, would the patient have survived, or what's the probability the patient would have survived if the patient had not been treated? In addition, we have existing data sets. So there's already lots of data that we've collected through observational studies that have already been completed, or also experimental studies which have been completed, but they were investigating, say, slightly different research questions. So the data is already here. What we like to do is extract as much possible information from the data. So we collect all the data, and then we put it in the computer, and then we ignore it. We should try to take this data and learn as much as we can from it. That can help us not only in advancing our knowledge, but also if we are still going to do randomized controlled trials, it can help us do better design of those randomized controlled trials in the future. And of course, as Dan mentioned earlier, everybody loves machine learning, and machine learning is widely used for prediction and classification. And when you do a machine learning analysis or a regression analysis, this is typically an observational data analysis problem also. So I want to start off with something which is called Simpson's paradox. And I wish I had a pointer, but I don't. So I'm just going to have to do it. So in Simpson's paradox, a drug is administered to men and women. Its effectiveness in terms of disease recovery is recorded. It's an observational study. Now, if you look closely at these numbers, you'll see that the men who get the drug recover 93% of the time. And the men that don't get the drug recover 87% of the time. So the drug appears to be effective for the men. Now let's look at the women. For the women who get the drug recover 73% of the time when they get the drug, and when they don't get the drug, they only recover 69% of the time. Now here's the interesting thing. So it works for both men and women. But now let's take the men data set and the women data set, we put them together, mix them up, okay? And now we find that for this combined data set, in this combined data set of men and women, 78% recover when they get the drug, and 83% recover when they don't get the drug. The exact same you can add those numbers up. You'll see they work out that way. If you want to wait 5 seconds for you to add them up, because you may not trust me. I show this slide to people, say, "Wait, don't move that slide. I want to look at that slide carefully." So you want to add those numbers up if you can. So we've got this data, okay, for this drug. We've collected it. We're not trying to do any fancy math. I just want to know whether or not to use the, should we use the drug or not? Is this drug going to hurt people or is it going to help people? That's all we want to know. So if we combine the male and female data, then it hurts people. But if we keep it separate, then it helps people. So the conclusion, of course, is the drug is effective if you know the gender of the person. But if you don't know their gender, then it's ineffective. Okay, so here's a related problem. And I want to call your attention to the fact that the numbers in this bottom table are exactly the same as the top table. They're exact same numbers. See that? Only thing I did was change the labeling. So I switched the columns for no drug and drug. I changed men to low blood pressure, women to high blood pressure, and men plus women to low blood pressure and high blood pressure. So now we have a conclusion that this drug is not effective if you know their blood pressure, but it's effective if you don't know their blood pressure. Okay, so let's now try to understand this a little bit more, because this is going to be central to the discussion. So it turns out that in the gender case, that women are more likely to take this drug, and the drug is less effective for women. So gender is affecting both the treatment and the outcome. So it's classified, the gender variable is classified as a confounder variable. On the other hand, in the blood pressure case, the way the drug works is it works by lowering the blood pressure. So the drug works, it lowers the blood pressure. Once the blood pressure is lowered, that helps the recovery. So in this case of the blood pressure is a mediator. So it turns out, and we'll explain this in the next slide or two, that the correct way to analyze the gender data is you have to separate the data by gender. And then you get the conclusion that the drug is effective. But if you separate the data by blood pressure, you'll get the wrong answer. The correct way to analyze the data for the blood pressure data is you have to keep the blood pressure groups combined. Turns out the drug is effective for the blood pressure group as well. So let's look at this in a little more detail. You can kind of keep going in a little more detail, step by step. In the Simpson's paradox here, we're conditioning on the mediator. So since blood pressure is on a causal pathway, we're basically blocking that causal pathway, and that reduces the total causal effect. So another way to think about it is that for the low blood pressure group, pretty much everybody recovers, so we don't see any changes in the effects of the drug. High blood pressure group, the drug doesn't work, so we don't see much effects of the drug. Now there's another idea here which I want to introduce, which is called Bergson's paradox. Now Bergson's paradox, I want to emphasize that that this diagram on the left is different from the diagram on the right. On the diagram on the right, the drug influences blood pressure, but blood pressure does not lie on a causal pathway from drug to recovery. Instead, both the drug and the recovery influence the blood pressure. So in the case that we talked about earlier, on the left, drug pressure works by lowering, drug presence works, the drug works by lowering the blood pressure, causing recovery. On the right side of the screen, we see that the presence of the drug decreases the blood pressure, but recovery also decreases the blood pressure. And if you think about this, it will turn out that basically, if you divide this up by blood pressure, the low blood pressure group will basically you will not see situations where when the drug is absent, the patient did not recover. Those will be very rare. And in the high blood pressure group, you won't see situations where when the drug is when the drug is present, the patient's recovered. So what happens when we condition upon a collider, which is basically defined as a variable in which the treatment and the outcome are both influencing, is we see that we actually are creating a fictitious causal effect. This is really bad, okay? Because we're actually seeing a causal effect that we've artificially created. Okay, so now, what I want to do now is I want to explain these diagrams in a little more detail. So I've kind of put these diagrams up, and I've talked about one variable influencing another, but I want to kind of be a little bit more precise about what I mean by this. So you might have seen this kind of diagram before, but if you haven't, no problem, because I'm going to explain it to you right now. Okay. So this is a probability model, and it says when event A occurs, that increases the probability that event B occurs. And so the arrow here represents correlation. This is what you typically see if you know, in the probabilistic modeling and machine learning literature and so on. And so an example would be, event A might be that I wake up in the morning, and event B might be within the hour the sun rises. And I record this, okay, do some measurements. I say, 98% of the time, when I get up in the morning, the sun rises within the next hour. That's great. That's true. That's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what happened. The percentage of times that the sun rises, given I get up in the morning, is 98%. Of course, that's not a causal relationship. When I get up in the morning, that does not cause the sun to rise. And so that's a correlational relationship. Now, so that's a probability model. This is a causal model. Here, we have the same notation, so it kind of, if you didn't look carefully, you'd think it was the same thing, but it's quite different, because the labeling on the arrow is causes. It's not correlation. And here we have A causes B. So what do we mean by A causes B? Well, I'm not going to give necessary and sufficient conditions for causality here, but I will provide a couple of characteristics that are important and relevant. So first, we have one characteristic which is called temporal ordering. So if A causes B, then event A should occur temporally before event B. Next, we have what's called the causal Markov assumption. And the idea here is that if the event B, or the random variable B, is independent of other events and random variables in the system, given its direct causes are known, we have a probabilistic criterion that if we know A, that increases the probability of B. We have a counterfactual criterion. If A had not occurred, then B would not have occurred. And finally, we have a physical independent mechanism characteristic, which says there's some sort of physical mechanism which is actually generating B from A. Okay, so now we're ready to, this is it. You know, this is the structural causal model. This is the big idea. So the blue circles correspond to observable variables that you would actually see in your data set. So in your data set, you have a spreadsheet, and one column is gender, one column is drug, one column is blood pressure, one column is recovery. So the blue circles are what you see in your spreadsheet. And the blue arrows represent your prior knowledge of how these, of causal relationships among these blue circles, among these observable variables. For example, we might know that if you have the drug that causes recovery, there's a direct causal pathway. But also we can see that gender is affecting both the treatment drug and the outcome recovery, so gender is a confounder. Now, what are these red clouds with the red arrows? Well, the red clouds are basically background noise disturbances. They're typically If you're a statistician, they're typically independent, exogenous random variables. But you don't have to worry about that. Just think of them as sort of background noise disturbances that are peculiar to a particular situation that you're in. And these background noise disturbances may be things that the researcher doesn't know about, or they may be things the researcher knows about but chooses to temporarily ignore for the purposes of the analysis. And we can actually, this entire diagram can actually be written down in a concise way using equations. And one of my PhD students once said that that some people need a diagram to understand equations. Dr. Golden needs equations to understand a diagram. But anyway, here are the equations. It says drug is the deterministic function of gender and a background disturbance, U drug. Blood pressure is a deterministic function of drug and a background disturbance, blood pressure. Gender is the deterministic function of a background disturbance, gender, U gender. And recovery is a deterministic function of drug, gender, blood pressure, and U recover. And there's sort of a deep philosophical message behind here, which, basically the idea is that these deterministic functions correspond to scientific laws that hold across many situations in the real world, even possible imaginary worlds. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I drop an object, I don't have anything to really drop, I have just to drop. So if I drop an object here, it falls to the podium. The idea is that that's going to happen regardless of what particular world I'm in, whether it's a real world or different situations or even imaginary worlds. And another example would be maybe heart disease is a risk factor for vascular dementia. Then we have these background factors, which are more situation-specific environmental factors. These are, as I said before, unknown, known but deliberately ignored, usually independent but sometimes correlated. So this entire complicated diagram is kind of hard to work with, so we have a simplified version where we basically don't put the word causes up all the time because we know we're just doing causal network analysis. And we leave out the little red clouds, but we know these little red clouds are hovering there in the background. So going back to our original problem, if we have a structural causal model like this, and gender is a confounder variable, what we learned previously is that what we need to do is we need to separate the male and female groups. And here we see at the bottom we have something new, which is a collider. I talked briefly about those. And for colliders, we do not want to separate out the low antibody and the high antibody group. So here, in other words, gender is influencing the treatment and outcome. Here, the drug produces antibodies, and the recovery produces antibodies. If we do the analysis by separating out the data into low antibody groups and high antibody groups, we're going to get the wrong answer and possibly create a fictitious causal relationship between the drug and recovery. Blood pressure is a mediator here. And so if we ideally should, for computing the total unconfounded causal effect, we should combine the low and high blood pressure groups. If we did separate them out, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It would just simply mean that we are focusing our attention on the causal pathway, which is on the other causal pathway rather than the blood pressure causal pathway, which is going to be blocked in that case. Now, there's another way to handle confounding random variables, which is instrumental variables. So the idea of an instrumental variable is that it only influences the cause and not the effect. And it's also not influenced by the effect or cause. So let me try to explain that. Suppose we have gender as a confounder variable, which is influencing the treatment and outcome. And instead of separating the data by gender, what we're going to do is we find an instrumental variable, drug availability. We might be in some parts of the country, the drug is more available than other parts of the country. And so we're going to see whether drug availability affects recovery. So in this case, whether or not the drug is available or not influences this drug. Our initial cause of interest drug becomes a mediator. It's on the, don't have a pointer, but it's on the causal pathway. And so if we see an effect of drug availability on recovery, that indicates that drug, in fact, it does have a causal link to recovery. And finally, the other sort of comment, and then I'm going to put all these little pieces together in a moment, is independent causal mechanisms. So suppose you did your causal model, and after you're all done with your causal model, you're interested in effective drug on recovery, and you notice something very interesting. Memory loss is unconnected, okay? And high blood pressure causes kidney disease, but that's also unconnected to the stuff you're interested in. So that suggests that maybe you don't have to bother including those in your analysis because they're irrelevant variables. So so we can sort of use the causal modeling to identify irrelevant variables. Okay, so now let's try to make this a little more practical. We have some data that was, this is a paper published by Kim et al. 2022, titled Counterfactual Analysis of Differential Comorbidity Risk Factors in Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias. And these covariates were extracted in this paper from the Cerner Health Facts database. And these are all possible covariates that could influence Alzheimer's disease. And our idea is we'd like to maybe predict whether somebody has Alzheimer's disease and related dementia using these covariates. And what I have drawn here on the screen, you could think of that as you want to think of it as a linear regression model, or a logistic regression model, or even a deep learning neural network. Any of those is fine. But having gone through our previous discussion, we have some questions that we might ask ourselves. For example, are some of these covariates confounders or instrumental variables, in which case we probably do want to include them to help us unconfound these causal effects, assuming we have a really smart machine learning algorithm. It could use this information to unconfound some of these causal effects. Are some covariates causally irrelevant? Well, if they're causally irrelevant, then no matter how advanced the machine learning algorithm is, it's not going to really help the machine learning algorithm. It's just going to confuse the machine learning algorithm. So let's help the machine learning algorithm out. I mean, we should, let's give machine learning algorithms a break, right? And then are some covariates mediators? Now, we probably don't want to include these because these could reduce the causal effect magnitude. And finally, we don't want to include covariates which are colliders because they could be sneaking in information about the response variable, which is basically could potentially result in fictitious causal effects, leading us to maybe think that we're making really great predictions when we're not. And so causal network analyses can address all of these great questions. But one problem, we can't do a causal network analysis without a causal model. So how do we get the causal model? This all sounded so great up to this point. Well, obviously, construction of causal graphs using prior knowledge is always preferred. If you go to the top of a mountain and get hit by a lightning bolt and come down with the causal model, that would be great. But that's not going to happen. Unfortunately, actually, that does happen. Actually, I mean, there are examples where we do have a lot of knowledge in a particular scientific domain. We can write down some causal graphs with confidence. But in many cases, however, scientific causal knowledge is fragmented, and we might have, however, we might have weak causal constraints, such as diabetes is not a direct cause of gender. Hospital location is not a direct cause of Alzheimer's disease. Cardiovascular disease is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So we might have these sort of weak causal constraints. And then, with this prior knowledge, we might also have an observational data set. And in the observational data set, we might be able to use this principle, no causation without correlation. This follows from the causal Markov assumption. And the basic idea of this is that if A causes B, then we would expect A and B to be correlated in the data set. If A and B are uncorrelated in the data set, and our causal model says that A causes B, we would say, whoa, wait a minute, let's take another look at our causal model. Maybe there's something that we're missing here in our model, or maybe there's something with the data set, but we need to kind of rethink this. So this is the basis for what are called causal discovery algorithms, where what they try to do is they take weak causal knowledge in the form of prior knowledge, these weak causal prior knowledge constraints, and you take a data set or data sets which and look at which variables are correlated, which variables are not correlated, and try to use this to come up with a set of causal graphs that are consistent with the weak causal knowledge and the observational data. And lots of times you are not going to get a unique causal graph. You might get a whole bunch of them. But this is basically the approach of these causal discovery algorithms. So Kim et al. 2022 actually did this with, they had in a paper titled Counterfactual Analysis of Differential Comorbidity, Risk Factors in Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias. And ADRD stands for Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementia. So if you look at this graph, you'll see on the right, look at the top graph, so they got two different causal models, one for African Americans and one for Caucasians. The one at the top, the ADRD, is our outcome variable. And we're looking at, and so we can see that cerebral artery occlusion with cerebral infarction influences late effects of cardiovascular disease, which then results in transient cerebral ischemia, resulting in Alzheimer's disease, and Parkinson's disease, memory loss, altered mental status, persistent mental disorders are also causally impacting the presence of Alzheimer's disease. For the Caucasian counterparts, we see that there is an effect of depression on it looks like there's a causal effect of depression on ADRD. We also have some instrumental variables, obesity, tobacco use disorder, anxiety disorder, late effect of cardiovascular disease. What's interesting here on the Caucasian graph is that we have three confounders. First, Parkinson's disease influences both depression and ADRD. Persistent mental disorders influences depression and ADRD. And altered mental status also influences depression and ADRD. So Parkinson's disease, persistent mental disorders, and altered mental status are all confounders. So returning to our prediction problem, we see that by referring to the African American causal graph, we might want to include artery occlusion, but we might want to omit hypertension because, as you can see, the arrow is coming from CVD outwards to hypertension. Late cardio disease, we don't want to include the late effects of CVD because that's a mediator on the causal pathway. Cerebral ischemia, again, ischemia, that's also a mediator. And urinary tract infection is also a mediator, so we don't want to include those. Parkinson's disease, memory loss, altered mental status, and mental disorders are all direct causes of ADRD, so we include those. Looking at the Caucasian causal graph, we see that we include the instrumental variables, obesity, tobacco use, anxiety disorder, and late effective cardiovascular disease. And because we're including these instrumental variables, that's going to handle the problem of having Parkinson's disease, persistent mental disorders, and altered mental status, which are confounders. So when the graphs get complicated, it's not always so obvious to determine whether one particular variable in the graph is affecting another variable. So therefore, it's used to have some software to help you out. Now, this is one example software package called Daggity. You can download it for free, or alternatively, you can just run it online without even downloading it. And it's very easy to use. So if you open it up and you start with a new model, you get one little dot there. And so what I did is I labeled the dot depression. And then you click on the screen, you get another little dot, you can label it ADRD. And then you click on the depression dot and then click on the ADRD dot and draw an arrow between them. And so in this way, you can build up a little causal graph. And so I just built up the Caucasian causal graph using this approach. And you see something very interesting. Look at the upper right-hand corner of this display here. You see how it says, I'm going to read this out loud, no adjustment is necessary to estimate the total effect of anxiety disorder, obesity, tobacco use disorder, late effect of cardiovascular disease, transient cerebral ischemia on ADRD. So it's basically saying, what that means is it's saying that the effect of these instrumental variables on the outcome variable is unconfounded. It's unbiased. It's causally unbiased. And we don't have to do any grouping, for example. Another interesting thing that comes up on this display is you see it says the model implies the following conditional independences. This is basically, it's under this phrase called testable implications. So for example, the first one says altered mental status, and this little weird sign, anxiety disorder. That means altered mental status is independent of anxiety disorder. So basically, the computer program analyzes this graph and says, aha, if these are the causal modeling assumptions, then the variable altered mental status should be statistically independent of anxiety disorder. So now you go to your data set and you go, whoa, the correlation between altered mental status and anxiety disorder is 0.99, you know. Well, maybe you have to re-examine this causal graph that we came up with. So this is a way to kind of double check test the assumptions of your causal modeling assumptions. So now in this next slide, what I did was I deleted the instrumental variables to see what would happen. So I deleted the instrumental variables, and you see these nice blue Parkinson's disease, persistent mental disorder, and altered mental status now become red, you know. And there's a little note up on the top saying, the minimal sufficient adjustment sets for estimating the total effect of depression on ADRD are altered mental status, Parkinson's disease, and persistent mental disorders. What this means is it means that the causal effect is confounded because of these confounding random variables. And what you need to do is you need to sort of group by, have one group which is a particular level of Parkinson's disease and persistent mental disorders and altered mental status, and then another group with a particular combination. You have to do the analysis by group to correctly estimate, to estimate an unconfounded causal effect. And actually, you can actually combine the results of all these groups as well, but I'm not going to mention that right now. Also, we have testable implications as before. So this is pretty cool. That's kind of, so that's what we got. Okay, so now something more fun to do is, with your causal model, is we can investigate deterministic counterfactual what-if analyses. So an Alzheimer's patient is treated with standard drugs, but the dementia evolves more rapidly after treatment. What would have happened? What would have happened if no treatment was provided? Okay, so we have this data. The patient dementia evolved more rapidly, we want to ask ourselves, what would have happened if we had not given treatment to this patient? This is what's called a what-if analysis. So how do we do this using causal modeling? So the first step is we estimate the causal model for the real world using observed data. So we're using the data from the Alzheimer's patient whose dementia evolved more rapidly after treatment. The second step is we estimate these background noise factors. This is sometimes going to be difficult to do unless the causal model is linear. But for now, let's just say we estimate the background noise factors. And then we change, for that patient, we change the variable. We go into our data set, and wherever it says drug present, we change it to, for that patient, we change it to drug absent. And so what we're doing is we're assuming that these background noise factors that we observed in the real world would have also be present in this imaginary world. And step 3 creates the imaginary world, and then step 4 computes the causal effect with noise factors from step 2 and the imaginary world adjustment in step 3. Now, a probabilistic counterfactual analysis is, here's an example of a probabilistic counterfactual analysis. Using the observational data we have collected in the real world, calculate the causal effect of hypertension on Alzheimer's disease for an imaginary world where no one is ever depressed. Okay. Okay, so step 1, estimate causal model for real world using observed data. Step 2, get the conditional probability distribution, joint distribution of these background noise factors, U hypertension, U artery disease, U depression, U ADRD. This step 2, by the way, can be done for even nonlinear causal models. It's using simulation methods, so it's not as restrictive as the deterministic counterfactual analysis approach. Step 3, now we create our happy world. All we have to do is set depression to false. Wish it was that easy, of course. And compute the causal effect using the noise sources derived from step 2 and the no depression assumption in step 3. I'll let you look at that for a little bit. Okay, so what's the take-home message? Well, random control trials are still good. Let's not get rid of them, okay? We're keeping them, okay? Still, we have observational data available. We want to learn as much as possible from these existing observational data sets. If we have observational data, we want to learn as much as possible. This can help us advance scientific knowledge. This can help us design more effective randomized controlled trials in the future. But causal inference from observational data sets causal inference from observational data sets is possible, but it is challenging. Now, why is it challenging? So first, when you're doing statistical modeling, you need to work with the probability model that's correct. If you're working with a probability model that's wrong, you're going to possibly make some bad inferences. So we have that problem right here that's shared by all statistical modeling. But now, in addition to that, we have another problem. The causal model has to be correctly specified. So not only do we have to have the probability model correctly specified, we also have to have the causal model correctly specified. So we have these additional requirements that we need to check. So in conclusion, we've discussed methods. Basically, we've discussed methods for improving the quality of causal inferences using observational data sets. It's not, it's a path to follow, but it's got a lot of, we've got a lot of issues that we need to deal with, but we're sort of trying to identify these issues. Also, I've provided for you some further reading. I didn't give you like 56 references. Like read these 10 books and then read these 40 papers. Instead, I tried to be selective. So first, I have the 2 articles which relate to the Alzheimer's disease example I talked about today. And the second bullet point is this book, very short book called Causal, Inference, and Statistics, a primer. Now, it's written for people that don't have a math background, but it's actually very technical. I mean, it's technical. I mean, it's got a lot of. It's a good book to read. Okay, it's short. It's challenging to read, but you can read it because it's not filled with a bunch of obscure mathematical notation. You might find that you're reading it 3 or 4 times, or 5 times, or 6 times, but before you understand it. But it's written in a very clear way with really easy to understand ideas. Also, I have some references for software, because when you're trying out a new statistical analysis, sometimes just sort of getting your hands dirty, getting some data, getting it into the computer, seeing what pops out kind of can be a little reassuring. And so here's some references for the Daggity software I talked about, and also this software package called DoY. There's lots of other software packages out there, but these I think are particularly good choices to maybe start with. And at this point, I think I will stop and take questions. Question?
Yes, I've had a lot of training in cognitive psychology and social equation. I have a question in common. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, yes. Thank you. Could you repeat your question so everybody else can hear?
I have a question and a comment. First, on this Daggity software, how does it use the data? You have to provide it a data set, right?
Actually, the Daggity software does not, you don't give it a data set. It's basically what you do is you draw your causal model, and it's basically going to make inferences such as, oh, this variable is a confounder, or these two variables are statistically independent under the assumption that if causation, that there's no causation without correlation.
Well, you have to have an operational definition for every variable. So take blood pressure.
Yeah.
Where there's 3 types. There's systolic blood pressure, which is an indicator. There's diastolic blood pressure, which is an indicator. Then you can combine the two in terms of mean arterial pressure. So what would be, when you say high blood pressure, what is the operational definition that the model would read to distinguish systolic, diastolic, and mean arterial pressure?
That is an extremely important point. And that is an absolutely important point. So the whole idea of the causal, one way to think of an important contribution of this sort of causal modeling framework is scientific communication. So when we draw a causal network, we need to define carefully, just going on, just like I did, for example, and saying blood pressure is not good. Okay, I just criticized my own talk. We need to say precisely what that variable is, what are the values. If we're not careful about defining the different nodes and their values, then these arrows that we're drawing are meaningless. So, does that help?
Yeah.
Did I answer your question, or did I not answer?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But you have to put in the various indicators for blood pressure.
Absolutely, and we want to be able to communicate to other researchers.
Yeah.
When you do a causal analysis, or even if you do an observational study and you're interpreting your results in terms of some sort of implicit causal model, forgetting about all the fancy software and stuff, just by writing down that causal model explicitly and defining the variables explicitly, that's an important scientific step forward, because then other researchers can examine that, criticize it, or agree with it.
This is a comment. One of the most overstated, and I've written on this, assumptions for causal, in terms of causal modeling, is temporal ordering. That was one of your earlier slides. A and B. There is in nature, A must precede B to show causality. There is in nature a number of instances of simultaneous causation.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect 2 quick examples is what caused the footprint in the sand. Well, once the foot is immediately placed in the sand, the result is the same as the cause. Another easy example in nature is what caused the bee sting. You stick your finger in a bee nest, you get stung. The bee stinger occurs simultaneously to the effect in the cause. But all these statisticians, they sit there and debate that for 30 years, A must precede B. So, there are exceptions to that.
And so there, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there was actually there are published papers in this field where people explicitly acknowledge that, and in the mathematical statistics field, and so yeah, I'm on board with that. I'm fine. It's just I just was trying to give kind of a simplified version. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, Doctor, it's fascinating, number one. So two-part question. As far as looking to the future, is this kind of software-assisted modeling going to displace randomized controlled trials? Because with scale and kind of constant learning, can we kind of get there? Because it's so expensive to do RCTs, number one. And then number two, it sounds like we should always question the science because, damn, you just blew our minds. I mean, there are so many variables constantly that can be missed.
I don't think we're going to replace randomized controlled trials. But when we do a randomized controlled trial, let's think about this. When you do a randomized controlled trial, I was thinking about this, as I was thinking about this talk. When you're doing a randomized controlled trial and you're starting off, suppose you're like a graduate student or a PhD student or somebody just sort of starting out, you're going to do your first randomized controlled trial. How am I going to even begin to start doing a randomized controlled trial? How do I know what to control for? How do I know, how do I do all these things? And then you sort of see from what other people have done and look at the literature. You try to make your best possible, that's what we all do. We try to make our best possible randomized controlled trial to get as much as we can in through that. So I see where we're going with this research is that we are trying to do the same thing with observational data. So instead of saying, well, it's observational data, just just go crazy, man, do anything you want, because you're not going to get anything useful from this. What we want to do here is have the same kind of principled theoretical approach, principled approach to analyzing observational data as we do to experimental data. That's where I think it's going. Complementary, yeah.
So I have a question. It sounds like maybe starting off with your observational data, I would call phase 1 trial, where you look to see does it even work, the treatment, let's just say. And then once you find out something to guide a randomized trial, you might do randomized trials. But then after that, you might do large observational again to get more at the fine points, and that will be a better sequence to help identify what's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what you might do is you might start with your observational data set and then design a randomized controlled trial, collect all that data, then you've answered that question, but now you've got more data, right? So now you can go back and do the cycle. You can learn as much as you can. You say, gee, I got this stuff that I didn't even notice should have been looking for popped up in my randomized controlled trial. And is it really legitimate? And can we do these kinds of analyses to learn as much as we can about this? So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you said about COVID, because the vaccine is interesting, because they didn't, they did some randomized trials, but not really. And just kind of launched it. So there's sometimes when you just kind of go, and now the data set could help us answer a lot of questions. Who did, who didn't, why, what systems? So that's another case where it may be that, in the beginning they did a little bit, but they'd been working on it for 2 decades. So they had a lot of data to drive what they were going to do.
Yeah. And sorry, didn't mean to cut you. Oh, I was just going to say that reminded me of something I don't think I emphasized in the talk, and I should have really emphasized. Using these kinds of analyses, not only can we determine how to unconfound the causal effect, but we can also determine when you cannot unconfound the causal effect. So you will have situations where you have this great causal model, you have this great observational data set, you want to see the effect of, say, depression on ADRD, on Alzheimer's disease-related disorders, and the analysis will say, you can't do it. And it will tell you that you can't do it, or it will tell you how you might be able to do it. Yeah.
Great talk. I was over at the simulation center a few days ago. Got a chance to try out on the Da Vinci surgery system. It's amazing. So I was talking with the surgeons and the research scientists about this relations with the surgery residents having played video games and the way that they can pick up the robotic surgery skill better.
Okay.
But I kind of throw in kind of a questions from a different perspective. So I asked them if they have looked at specific video games. In my mind, I was throwing out like Mortal Kombat versus Super Mario Kart, and I don't think they get my point. But anyway, well, my perspective of differentiate even further into that aspect of the brain, I guess training versus a different skill set in Da Vinci. So looking at having seen your research work, I'm trying to see if they can utilize your research and come up with a future experiment. That's really what I would like to hear.
I didn't. Could you rephrase that? Just yeah. I apologize.
Sorry, I usually talk too much and
No,
get people
that's
confused.
fine. No.
The question is, does your model or your tool set help those researchers come up with a model that they are not familiar with?
That what?
That they are not familiar with. Like my suggestion to them, and they are not sure how to approach it. So I'm just asking, can your tool set help them to create a model?
A causal model?
Yeah.
So I think these causal discovery algorithms could be adapted to create causal models. Maybe if that's what the question you're asking, yes. Yeah.
Okay. We're about at the top of the hour, but given we have Dr. Golden here, I thought it only appropriate that an algorithm weigh in also. So ChatGPT is not great at asking questions of speakers, but it is good at it can human tag team with. So I had asked ChatGPT about collider variables and that concern. That seems central, right? Because that is a human being confused about a false cause and inferring the false cause with our imagination. The algorithm says to address collider bias, it is important to identify and adjust for confounders appropriately, consider the underlying causal structure, and apply appropriate statistical methods, such as stratification, regression, or propensity score techniques to minimize the impact of collider bias on causal inference. What are your thoughts on that answer from an algorithm. And what would you say differently?
Well, I mean, so first of all, see,
I'll let the algorithm know what your answer is.
it seems like every week somebody's asking me a question about what I think about ChatGPT. When really I should be referring them to my PhD students. But in any case, so, you know, they were, like, it was talking about stratification. You don't want to do stratification with a collider. I was at a faculty lunch, and some faculty were talking about ChatGPT. And one of them said that they had asked a technical question to ChatGPT, and one of the answers was, both answers sounded really good to PhD students, first of all. Okay, but one answer was technically correct, and the other answer was totally wrong. They even made up references, references that did not exist anywhere, okay, to support its conclusion. So the two answers looked, to a typical PhD student, they looked pretty much equivalent. So this is sort of a problem.
Algorithms have imagination too.
Yeah, well, but I want to come back to this idea of algorithms have imagination, because you made sort of a comment about this in your introduction. You're kind of coming back to this. These counterfactual analyses that we're talking about here are basically, one can advance artificial intelligence using these counterfactual analyses, because now, instead of the artificial intelligence just making up prediction, the artificial intelligence can go, so what if I did this instead of that? What would have happened? You know, so it's kind of actually doing counterfactual reasoning, which is a type of inference that we typically aren't used to seeing with machine learning. We're used to thinking of machine learning as more predictive. Now, this I'm not going to be signing some memo to say we need to suspend all our research activities to prevent AI from taking over the world. But I'm just saying that AI is just a tool. It's I like to think of AI, the way I like to describe AI as a artificial intelligence is like going to buy a magic trick at a magic store, and they show you this magic trick where the card rises mysteriously from the deck, and they ask you, and you say, "Wow, it's a great trick. How can I do that?" "Oh, you can do it. You just have to buy the trick." So you pay $50. They give you a piece of gum, which you stick to your thumb, and then you stick the thumb to the back of the card deck and make the card rise. Okay. And so now it's not so magical anymore, right? And worst of all, you paid $50 for a piece of used gum. But I think artificial intelligence is kind of like that, right? I mean, when we don't really understand what it's doing, there's a lot of mystery associated. Once we understand what it's doing, it's not it's not so amazing. Yeah. So.
Okay, that's an odd note to end on. That you've revealed the used gum on the thumbprint of the human being in this talk. But I think you've given us some amazing food for thought and incredibly important future directions on how we can use algorithms to better craft experiments, RCTs, and make better diagnoses ultimately. So a great place to end for the year in Frontiers. Thanks so much, Dr. Golden, and thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you again in the fall.